She's in my yard, face down on the grass, and she has absolutely no idea how she got there. Which sounds dramatic, I know, but stick with me because the whole thing reads like a slow burn prank that accidentally graduated to civil engineering. It started as a knock, a hand on the fence, a complaint about dandelions, and by the time it ended, someone who treated other people like lawn ornaments had been unceremoniously deposited on soft turf, and honestly, I still wake up some mornings replaying that laugh she gave me like it was a soundtrack to the whole plan. So yeah, let me tell you how we got from polite nods to a thud in my backyard because there's a lesson in here, and I want you to feel every quiet inch of it. It was early spring, the kind of morning where the light looks like forgiveness, and I was on my knees with a coffee mug balanced on the porch rail, pulling weeds from the base of the garden bed. That mundane, almost meditative stuff that keeps you grounded. My fence is the standard 6-foot wooden privacy kind, the neighborhood's official keep-to-yourself barrier. I'd lived in the house 4 years, 2 of which I barely knew my neighbor even existed. We waved, we did the occasional, how's the weather small talk, which is the entire Castillo of good suburban civility. Then one morning in March, a hand slapped the top of that fence and a voice said plain as daylight, "You know your weeds are spreading to my property, right? That's a violation." They were dandelions on my side, not touching the fence. I told her calmly, "They're on my property. I'm taking care of them." She stood like an executioner with a clipboard for 5 seconds, then walked away. Weird, I thought. Probably a one-off. Next morning, the slap again. "Your porch light was on all night. It shines into my bedroom." The angle was impossible, but I altered the light anyway. Sometimes reasonable people do unreasonable things to keep the peace, and that's a skill set we're trained in. Then the complaints multiplied like mold in a poorly ventilated bathroom. Lawn too long. Car detracting from the street's curb appeal. Recycling not sorted properly. Garden hose coiled incorrectly. Chester, my dog, who treats life with the urgency of a loaf of bread, was barking too much, and that apparently was a felony in the eyes of whoever was leaning over my fence. The delivery was always the same, arms folded over the top rail, chin forward, voice sharp enough to slice through thermal glass. I started writing down date, time, exact words because something in me knew a record might matter. 3 weeks in, the tone changed from petty zoning to personal. Standing inside my kitchen, I heard her through a closed window, stepping into my yard again with a sentence ready like a scalpel. "You are a disappointment to the whole street." There's a difference between filing a noise complaint and declaring someone unworthy of their house. And that statement delivered across the rail with a laugh like she'd collected mental rent clicked. This wasn't a bad day or an argument over sunlight. It was an attack on my personhood. I asked her to stop. She laughed. She walked away. Then the neighbor on the other side, quiet guy, salt-of-the-earth type, who rarely speaks louder than the mailbox, cornered me at the end of the driveway and said something that hammered the air out of my lungs. The man who'd lived in my house before me had been pushed by the same woman for almost a year and ended up selling packing, leaving. He said, "She picks a house, works on the person, and she does it until they go." That's when the seed of a plan or a countermeasure planted itself. I didn't want to sell my home. I wasn't going to cave to passive harassment. But I also didn't want to escalate to lawyers or HOA wars right away. What I needed was something that would stop the behavior without making me the person who screamed first. Then I started looking at the fence differently. See, one panel, the one she always leaned on, was the second from the back corner. Always the same spot, always the same pressure, always the same posture. I studied the wood, the brackets, the weather swell and contraction, the bottom connection points that had loosened over winters. Physics, I realized, would be kinder than confrontation. Simple. Leverage a pivot point at the top, a sliding bottom, a geometry of embarrassment rather than a brawl. If the bottom could move while the top stayed fixed, leaning on the top would cause the panel to pivot inward, and whoever was leaning over would tip forward with it. Nothing violent. No broken bones, but a disorienting, undeniable fall onto my grass. So I tested the idea. One evening I swapped out the bottom screws for smooth-shanked pins, same diameter. So from either side it looked untouched, and weighted the bottom rail on my side with a hidden chain tucked behind the ornamental grass. The panel now pivoted on the top brackets, contextually identical, mechanically different. I pressed from Karen's side with the pressure I'd seen before. It swung smooth and quiet, exactly as designed. That was the moment when option met execution, and I told myself I'd sleep on it. I needed conviction, not vindication. Monday morning she came back. arms over the top rail, chin forward, waiting for me to appear so she could perform whatever daily ritual of accusation she'd chosen. I watched from the window because the plan counted on her performing for an audience. She needed witnesses to feed her momentum, and without one she leaned harder to force the show. She called my name, louder, leaned more. The panel hadn't moved yet. I held my breath because I had that private, terrible thrill of someone watching a carefully stacked house of cards and knowing which card you'd pull. Then, and this is where the story turns, there was another woman there I'd never seen before, standing a few feet behind Karen, holding a phone pointed at my house. Older, maybe mid-60s, well-dressed, calm, the way people who've been around storms tend to look composed. For a second, I thought I'd been ambushed by some secret surveillance setup. Either she was Karen's accomplice recording evidence to use against me, or she was recording Karen for a reason that had nothing to do with me. Either of those possibilities could ruin what I'd built, but there was no stopping circumstance. Karen leaned forward and the panel rotated. She went down slow, like a bad dream, in real time. No dramatic yelp, just a sharp gasp, and then the dull thud of hands on grass. Chester patted out to sniff at her shoe like she was a very confusing delivery, and I stepped out in the way you step toward a minor emergency where the correct action is to assess before you react. Karen wasn't seriously hurt, a 2.5-foot drop onto soft turf, but furious, that quiet prelude to a shout. She accused me loud, claiming the fence was broken, that I'd done it on purpose, threats about the HOA and the city and plaintiffs, as if she'd already rehearsed her lines. Then the phone woman walked through the side gate, calm as a judge entering a courtroom, and said 3 words that rewired the scene. "I got it." She turned the phone toward Karen and showed her 3 weeks of clips, timestamps, and all of Karen leaning over my fence, shouting the pattern documented clear as glass. Karen's face shifted from anger to recognition to a kind of alarm I'd never seen on her. The woman introduced herself as Donna later, but in that moment she was a plot twist and an ally. She'd been watching Karen do this to people for years. She recognized the cadence, the targeting, the method. 11 years ago, she'd been on the receiving end of the same campaign in another neighborhood. She and her husband had moved. When she saw my mornings, she started recording. Quietly, patiently. Not because anyone told her to, but because some people see trouble and decide to make it visible. Donna sat with me in my backyard after Karen walked away, and she showed me clip after clip. Relief washed over me like rain. Not vindictive joy, more like permission. Permission to believe I wasn't imagining the harassment. The recordings were evidence, plain and simple, and they moved this from "did I misread this" to "this is real and this is systemic." Donna said she'd be willing to share them if needed. She left with a nod that meant more than words. In the days that followed, Karen didn't come back to the fence. No HOA complaints, no city inspectors, no letters. Silence isn't always peace. It's sometimes the echo of a storm passing. I repaired the panel properly. 2 weeks later, real screws, no pins, chain gone, and the fence looked identical to its pre-plot state, which is the cruelest little joke. The whole affair plays outwardly, the world appears unchanged, but emotion has been redirected. So, what's the lesson here? I'll tell you mine without sermonizing, and it's not a neat moral with a marketable tagline. First, sometimes control looks like cruelty dressed up in civic duty. A complaint is sometimes a weapon. Second, you don't have to be loud to be effective. Quiet records, a phone, a note, a neighbor who notices can be the difference between being gaslit and being seen. Third, justice isn't always legal. Sometimes it's social, it's exposure, and it's someone who remembers what you taught them about kindness and repays the lesson with a recording. Was what I did reasonable, clever, petty? Maybe all 3. I engineered a humiliation instead of an arrest, and I'll be frank, if the tables were turned, I'd want someone to do the same to my tormentor. The man before me left. I stayed. Chester still tilts his head when the morning light hits the fence corner. The mornings are quiet now, and that quiet is a complicated piece. Here's what I want from you. Tell me, did I go too far? Or did Karen get exactly what she'd built for herself? And if you've ever had a neighbor push you to a place you never thought you'd go, share it. Honesty. Here is the currency that buys real advice, not outrage. These stories matter because they happen to decent people all the time. And too often they dissolve into just move or call someone, while the real damage is what stays with you. If this whole thing held your attention, Hit like drop a comment saying ready for the story and share it with someone who'd understand why sometimes people choose a non-violent, quietly theatrical kind of justice. I'll read every story. I want to know what you think. Was this defense or revenge, clever or cruel? Where do we draw the line between protecting our home and becoming the very thing we despise?
Cảm ơn các bạn đã xem video. Cảm ơn các bạn đã xem video.